Chapter 17, the Ramadan. As Queequeg's Ramadan, or fasting and humiliation, was to continue all day, I did not choose to disturb him till towards nightfall, for I cherish the greatest respect towards everybody's religious obligations, never mind how comical, and could not find it in my heart to undervalue even a congregation of ants worshipping a toadstool, or those other creatures in certain parts of our earth who, with a degree of footmanism quite unprecedented in other planets, bow down before the torso of a deceased landed proprietor merely on account of the inordinate possessions yet owned and rented in his name. I say, we good Presbyterian Christians should be charitable in these things and not fancy ourselves so vastly superior to other mortals, pagans and whatnot, because of their half-crazy conceits on these subjects. There was Queequeg now, certainly entertaining the most absurd notions about Yojo and his Ramadan. But what of that? Queequeg thought he knew what he was about, I suppose. He seemed to be content, and there let him rest. All our arguing with him would not avail. Let him be, I say, and heaven have mercy on us all, Presbyterians and pagans alike, for we are all somehow dreadfully cracked about the head and sadly need mending. Towards evening, when I felt assured that all his performances and rituals must be over, I went up to his room and knocked at the door, but no answer. I tried to open it, but it was fastened inside. "Queequeg," said I softly through the keyhole. All silent. "I say, Queequeg, why don't you speak? It's I, Ishmael." But all remained still as before. I began to grow alarmed. I had allowed him such abundant time, I thought he might have had an apoplectic fit. I looked through the keyhole, but the door opening into an odd corner of the room, the keyhole prospect was but a crooked and sinister one. I could only see part of the footboard of the bed and a line of the wall, but nothing more. I was surprised to behold resting against the wall the wooden shaft of Queequeg's harpoon, which the landlady the evening previous had taken from him before mounting to the chamber. That's strange, thought I. But at any rate, since the harpoon stands yonder and he seldom or never goes abroad without it, therefore he must be inside here, and no possible mistake.
Queequeg, Queequeg. All still. Something must have happened. Apoplexy. I tried to burst open the door, but it stubbornly resisted. Running downstairs, I quickly stated my suspicions to the first person I met, the chambermaid. "La, la," she cried. "I thought something must be the matter. I went to make the bed after breakfast, and the door was locked, and not a mouse to be heard. And it's been just so silent ever since. But I thought maybe you had both gone off and locked your baggage in for safekeeping. La, la, ma'am, mistress, murder! Mrs. Hussey, apoplexy!" And with these cries, she ran toward the kitchen, I following. Mrs. Hussey soon appeared, with a mustard pot in one hand and a vinegar cruet in the other, having just broken away from the occupation of attending to the castors and scolding her little black boy meantime. "Woodhouse," cried I, "which way to it? Run, for God's sakes, and fetch something to pry open the door. The axe, the axe! He's had a stroke, depend on it." And so saying, I was unmethodically rushing upstairs again empty-handed, when Mrs. Hussey interposed the mustard pot and vinegar cruet and the entire castor of her countenance. "What's the matter with you, young man? Get the axe! For God's sakes, run for the doctor, someone, while I pry it open." "Look here," said the landlady, quickly putting down the vinegar cruet so as to have one hand free. "Look here, are you talking about prying open any of my doors?" And with that, she seized my arm. "What's the matter with you? What's the matter with you, shipmate?" In as calm but rapid a manner as possible, I gave her to understand the whole case. Unconsciously clasping the vinaigrette cruet to one side of her nose, she ruminated for an instant, then exclaimed, "No, I haven't seen it since I put it there." Running to a little closet under the landing of the stairs, she glanced in, and returning, told me that Queequeg's harpoon was missing. "He's killed himself," she cried. "It's unfortunate. Stig's done over again, and there goes another counterpane. God pity his poor mother. It will be the ruin of my house." "Has a poor lad a sister? Where's that girl? There, Betty, go to Snarls the painter and tell him to paint me a sign with 'No suicides permitted here' and 'No smoking in the parlor.' Might as well kill both birds at once. Kill? The Lord be merciful to his ghost. What's that noise there? You, young man, avast there." and running up after me, she caught me as I was again trying to force open the door. "I won't allow it. I won't have my premises spoiled. Go for the locksmith. There's one about a mile from here. But avast!" Putting her hand in her side pocket, "Here's a key that'll fit, I guess. Let's see." And with that, she turned it in the lock. But alas, Queequeg's supplemental bolt remained undrawn within. "Have to burst it open," said I, and was running down the entry a little for a good start when the landlady caught me again vowing I should not break down her premises. But I tore from her, and with a sudden bodily rush, dashed myself full against the mark. With a prodigious noise, the door flew open, and the knot slamming against the wall sent the plaster to the ceiling. And there, good heavens, there sat Queequeg, altogether cool and self-collected, right in the middle of the room, squatting on his hams, and holding Yojo on top of his head. He looked neither one way nor the other way, but sat like a carved image with scarce a sign of active life. "Queequeg," said I, going up to him, "Queequeg, what's the matter with you?" "He ain't been sitting like so all day, has he?" said the landlady. But all we said, not a word could we drag out of him. I almost felt like pushing him over so as to change his position, for it was almost intolerable. It seemed so painfully, unnaturally constrained, especially as in all probability he had been sitting so for upwards of 8 or 10 hours, going too without his regular meals. "Mrs. Hussey," said I, "he's alive at all events, so leave us if you please, and I will see to this strange affair myself." Closing the door upon the landlady, I endeavored to prevail upon Queequeg to take a chair, but in vain. There he sat, and all he could do, for all my polite arts and blandishments, he would not move a peg, nor say a single word, nor even look at me, nor notice my presence in any way. I wonder, thought I, if this can possibly be a part of his Ramadan. Do they fast on their hams that way in his native island? It must be so. Yes, it's part of his creed, I suppose. Well, then, let him rest. He'll get up sooner or later, no doubt. It can't last forever, thank God, and his Ramadan only comes once a year, and I don't believe it's very punctual then. I went down to supper, after sitting a long time listening to the long stories of some sailors who had just come from a plum pudding voyage, as they called it, that is, a short whaling voyage in a schooner or brig, confined to the north of the line in the Atlantic Ocean only. After listening to these plum puddingers till nearly 11 o'clock, I went upstairs to go to bed, feeling quite sure by this time Queequeg must certainly have brought his Ramadan to a termination. But no, there he was, just where I had left him. He had not stirred an inch. I began to grow vexed with him. It seemed so downright senseless and insane to be sitting there all day and half the night on his hams in a cold room, holding a piece of wood on his head. For heaven's sakes, Queequeg, get up and shake yourself. Get up and have some supper. You'll starve. You'll kill yourself, Queequeg. But not a word did he reply. Despairing of him, therefore, I determined to go to bed and to sleep, and no doubt before a great while he would follow me. But previous to turning in, I took my heavy bearskin jacket and threw it over him, as it promised to be a very cold night, and he had nothing but his ordinary round jacket on. For some time, do all I would, I could not get into the faintest doze. I had blown out the candle, and the mere thought of Queequeg, not 4 feet off, sitting there in that uneasy position, stark alone in the cold and dark, this made me really wretched. Think of it, sleeping all night in the same room with a wide-awake pagan on his hams in this dreary, uncountable Ramadan. But somehow I dropped off at last, and knew nothing more till break of day, when, looking over the bedside, there squatted Queequeg, as if he had been screwed down to the floor. But as soon as the first glimpse of sun entered the window, up he got, with stiff and grating joints, but with a cheerful look, limped toward me where I lay, pressed his forehead again against mine, and said his Ramadan was over.
Now, as I before hinted, I have no objection to any person's religion, be what it may, so long as that person does not kill or insult any other person because that person does not believe it also. But when a man's religion becomes really frantic, when it is a positive torment to him and, in fine, makes this earth of ours an uncomfortable inn to lodge in, then I think it is high time to take an individual aside and argue the point with him. And just so now I did with Queequeg. "Queequeg," said I, "get into bed now and lie and listen to me." And then I went on, beginning with the rise and progress of the primitive religions and coming to the various religions of the present time, during which I labored to show Queequeg that all these Lents, Ramadans, and prolonged ham-squantings in cold, cheerless rooms were stark nonsense, bad for the health, useless for the soul, opposed, in short, to the obvious laws of hygiene and common sense. I told him, too, that him being in other things such an extremely sensual and sagacious savage, it pained me, very badly pained me, to see him now so deplorably foolish about this ridiculous Ramadan of his. Besides, I argued, fasting makes the body cave in, hence the spirit caves in, and all thoughts born of a fast must necessarily be half-starved. This is the reason why most dyspeptic religionists cherish such melancholy notions about their hereafters. In one word, Queequeg, said I, rather digressively, hell is an idea first born on undigested apple dumplings, and since the perpetuated thought of this hereditary dyspepsia nurtured by Ramadans. I then asked Queequeg whether he himself was ever troubled with dyspepsia, expressing the idea very plainly so that he could take it in. He said no, only upon one memorable occasion, and after a great feast given to him by his father, the king, of gaining a great battle where 50 of the enemy had been killed by about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and all cooked and eaten that very evening. No more Queequeg, I said, and shuddering, that will do. For I knew the inferences without him further hinting them. I had seen a sailor who had visited that very island, and he told me that it was the custom, when a great battle had been gained there, to barbecue all the slain in the yard or garden of the victor, and then, one by one, they were placed in great wooden trenchers, and garnished round the palu with breadfruit and coconuts, and with some parsley in their mouths, were sent round with the victor's complaints to all his friends, just as these presents were so many Christmas turkeys. After all, I do not think that my remarks about religion made much impression upon Queequeg, because, in the first place, he somehow seemed dull of hearing on that very important subject, unless considered from his own point of view, and, in the second place, he did not more than one-third understand me, couch my ideas simply as I would, and finally, he no doubt thought he knew a good deal more about the true religion than I did. He looked at me as a sort of condescending concern and compassion, as though he thought it was a great pity that such a sensible young man should be so hopelessly lost to infidel pagan piety. At last we rose and dressed, and Queequeg, taking a prodigiously hearty breakfast of chowders of all sorts, so that the landlady should not have made such a profit by his reason of his Ramadan, we sailed out to board the Pequod, sauntering along and picking our teeth with halibut bones. Chapter 18. As we were walking down the end of the wharf towards the ship, Queequeg carried his harpoon. Captain Pele, and his gruff voice loudly hailed us from the wigwam, saying he had not suspected my friend was a cannibal, and furthermore announcing that he let no cannibal aboard his craft unless they previously produced their papers. What do you mean by that, Captain Pele? And I, now jumping on the bulwark and leaving my comrade standing on the wharf, I mean, he replied, he must show his papers. Yeah, said Captain Bildad in his hollow voice, sticking his head from behind Pele's out of the wigwam. He must show that he's converted, son of darkness, he added, turning to Queequeg. Art thou present in communion with any Christian church? Why, said I, he is a member of the First Congregational Church. Here be it said, and many tattooed savages sailed in the Nantucket ships, at last come to be converted into the churches. First Congregational Church, cried Bildad. What? That worship in the Deacon Detrimunity Coleman's meeting house? And so saying, taking out his spectacles, he rubbed them with his great yellow bandana handkerchief, and putting them on very carefully, came out of the wigwam, and leaning stiffly over the bulwark, took a good long look at Queequeg. How long hath he been a member? He said, turning to me. Not very long, I rather guess, young man. No, said Pele. He hasn't been baptized right either, or would have been washed some of the devil's blue off his face. Do tell now, cried Bildad. Is this Philistine a regular member of the Deacon Detronomany meeting? I never saw him going there, and I pass it every Lord's Day. I don't know anything about Deacon Detronomany or his meetings, said I. All I know is that Queequeg here is a born member of the First Congregational Church. He's a deacon himself, Queequeg is. Young man, said Bildad sternly. Thou art skylarking with me. Explain thyself, thou young Hittite. What church does thee mean? Answer me.
Finding myself hard pushed, I replied, I mean, sir, the same ancient Catholic Church to which you and I and Captain Peleg there in Queequeg and all of us and every mother, son, and soul of us belong. The great and everlasting first congregation of this whole worshiping world, we all belong to that. Only some of us cherish some queer crotchets, no ways touching on the grand belief in that we all join hands. Splice, thou meanest splice hands, cried Peleg, drawing nearer. Young man, you'd better ship for a missionary instead of a foremast hand. I never heard a better sermon. Deacon Deuteronomy, why, Father Mapple himself couldn't beat it, and he's reckoned something. Come aboard, come aboard. Never mind about the papers. I say, tell Quahog there, what's that you call him? Tell Quahog to step along by the great anchor. What a harpoon he's got there. Looks like good stuff, that, and he handles it about right. I say, Quahog, or whatever your name is, did you ever stand in the head of a whaleboat? Did you ever strike a fish? Without saying a word, Queequeg, in his wild sort of way, jumped upon the bulwarks, from thence into the bows of one of the whaleboats, hanging to the side, and then bracing his left knee and poising his harpoon, cried out in some such way as this, Captain, you see him small drop tar on water, dear? You see him? Well, suppose him one whale eye, well dead. And taking sharp aim at it, he darted the iron right over old Bildad's broad brim, clean across the ship's deck, and struck the glistening tar spot out of sight. Now, said Queequeg, quietly hauling in the line, suppose he whale eye, why, Dad, whale dead. Quick, Bildad, said Peleg, his partner, who, aghast at the close vicinity of the flying harpoon, had retreated towards the cabin gangway. Quick, I say you, Bildad, and get the ship's paper. We must have Quahog, in one of our boats. Look ye, Quahog, we'll give you the 90th lay, and that's more than ever was given a harpooner yet out of Nantucket. So down we went into the cabin, and to my great joy, Queequeg was soon enrolled among the same ship's company to which I myself belonged. When all the preliminaries were over, and Peleg had got everything ready for signing, he turned to me and said, I guess, Quahog, there don't know how to write, does he? I say, Quahog, blast ye, dost sign thy name, or make thy mark? But at this question, Queequeg, who had twice or thrice before taken part in similar ceremonies, looked no ways abashed, but taking the offered pen, copied upon the paper in the proper place an exact counterpart of a queer round figure which was tattooed upon his arm, so that through Captain Peleg's obstinate mistake, touching his appellative, it stood out something like this, Quahog his mark. Meanwhile, Captain Bildad sat earnestly and steadfastly eyeing Queequeg, and at last rising solemnly and fumbling in the huge pockets of his broad-skirted drab coat, took out a bundle of tracts and selected one entitled The Latter Day Coming or No Time to Lose, and placed it in Queequeg's hands, and then grasping them, and the book with both his, looked earnestly into his eyes, and said, Son of darkness, I must do my duty by thee. I am part owner of the ship, and feel concern for all the souls of all this crew. If thou still clingest to thy pagan ways, which I sadly fear, I beseech thee, remain not for a Belial bondsman. Spurn the idol, Bel and the hideous dragon, turn from the wrath to come. Mind thy eye. I say, O goodness gracious, steer clear of the fiery pit. Something of the salt sea yet lingered in old Bildad's language, heterogeneously mixed with scriptural and domestic phrases. Avast there, Bildad, avast, now spoiling our harpooner, cried Peleg. Pious harpooneers never made good voyagers. It takes the shark out of them. No harpooner is worth a straw who ain't pretty sharkish. There was young Nat Swain, once the bravest boatheader out of all Nantucket in the vineyard. He joined the meeting and never came to good. He got so frightened about his plague-eyed soul that he shrinked and shared away from whales for fear of afterclaps, in case he got stove and went to Davy Jones. Peleg, said Bildad, lifting his eyes and hands, thou thyself, as I myself, have seen many a perilous time. Thou knowest, Peleg, what it is to have the fear of death. How then canst thou prate in this ungodly guise? Thou beliest thine own heart, Peleg. Tell me, when has the same Pequod here had her 3 masts overboard in that typhoon on Japan, that same voyage when thou went mate with Captain Ahab? Didst thou not think of death and the judgment then? Hear him now, cried Peleg, marching across the cabin and thrusting his hands far down into his pockets. Hear him, all of ye, think of that. When every moment we thought the ship would sink. Death and judgment then, what? With all 3 masts, making such an everlasting thundering against the side in every sea, breaking over us fore and aft. Think of death and the judgment then? No, no time to think about death then. Life is what Captain Ahab and I was thinking of, and how to save all hands, how to rig jury mast, how to get into the nearest port. That's what I was thinking of. Bildad said no more, but buttoning up his coat, stalked on deck where we followed him. There he stood very quietly overlooking some sailmakers who were mending a topsail in the waist. Now and then he stooped to pick up a patch or save an end of the tarred twine, which otherwise might have been wasted.
Chapter 19, The Prophet. Shipmates, have you shipped in that ship? Queequeg and I had just left the Pequod and were sauntering away from the water, for the moment each occupied by his own thoughts, when the above words were put to us by a stranger, who, pausing before us, leveled his massive forefinger at the vessel in question. He was but shabbily apparelled in faded jacket and patched trousers, a rag of a black handkerchief investing his neck. A confluent smallpox had in all directions flowed over his face and left it like the complicated ribbed bed of a torrent, when the rushing waters have been dried up. "Have you shipped in her?" he repeated. "You mean the ship Pequod, I suppose," said I, trying to gain a little more time for an uninterrupted look at him. "Aye, the Pequod, that ship there," he said, drawing back his whole arm and then rapidly shoving it straight out from him, with the fixed bayonet of his pointing figure darted full at the object. "Yes," said I, "we've just signed the articles." "Anything down there about your souls?" "About what?" "Oh, perhaps you haven't got any," he said quickly. "No matter, though. I know many chaps that haven't got any. Good luck to them. And they are all the better off for it. A soul's a sort of a fifth wheel to a wagon." "What are you jabbering about, shipmate?" said I. "He's got enough, though, to make up for all deficiencies of that sort in other chaps," abruptly said the stranger, placing a nervous emphasis upon the word he. "Queequeg," said I, "let's go. This fellow's broken loose from somewhere. He's talking about something and somebody we don't know." "Stop!" cried the stranger. "Ye said true. You haven't seen Old Thunder yet, have ya?" "Who's Old Thunder?" said I, again riveted with the intense earnestness of his manner. "Captain Ahab." "What, the captain of the ship, the Pequod?" "Aye, among some of us old sailor chaps he goes by that name. You haven't seen him yet, have ya?" "No, we haven't. He's sick, they say, but he's getting better, and we'll be all right again before long." "All right again before long," laughed the stranger with a solemnly derisive sort of laugh. "Look ye, when Captain Ahab is all right, then his left arm of mine will be all right. Not before." "What do you know about him?" "What did they tell you about him? Say that." "They didn't tell much of anything about him, only I've heard he's a good whale hunter and a good captain to his crew." That's true. Yes, both true enough. But you must jump when he gives an order. Step and growl. Growl and go. That's the word with Captain Ahab. But nothing about that thing that happened to him off Cape Horn long ago, when he lay like dead for 3 days and 3 nights. Nothing about that deadly scrimmage with the Spaniard before the altar in Santa. Heard nothing about that, eh? Nothing about the silver calabash he spat into? And nothing about his losing his last voyage? His leg, according to the prophecy? Didn't you hear a word about them matters and something more, eh? No, I don't think you did, now could ya? Who knows it? Not all Nantucket, I guess. But howsever, mayhap, you've heard about the leg and how he lost it. Aye, ye have heard about that, I dare say. Yes, that everyone knows about. I mean, they know he's lost only one leg, and that a Parma City took the other off. My friend, said I, what's up? What all this gibberish of yours is about, I don't know, and I don't much care. For it seems to me that you must be a little damaged in the head. But if you were speaking about Captain Ahab, of that ship there, the Pequod, then let me tell you, I know all about the loss of his leg. All about it, eh? Sure you do? All? Pretty sure. With finger pointed and eye leveled at the Pequod, the beggar-like stranger stood for a moment, as if in a troubled reverie. Then, starting a little, turned and said, You've shipped, have ya? Names down on the papers, well, what's signed is signed, and what's to be will be. And then again, perhaps it won't be after all. Anyhow, it's all fixed and arranged already, and some sailors or other must go with him, I suppose, as well as any other men. God's pity 'em. Morning to ye, shipmates, morning. The ineffable heavens bless ye. I'm sorry I've stopped ye.
Look here, friend, said I. If you have anything important to tell us, out with it. But if you are only trying to bamboozle us, you are mistaken in your game. That's all I have to say. And it's very well said, and I like to hear a chap talk up that way. You are just the man for him, the likes of ye. Morning to ye, shipmates, morning. Oh, when you get there, tell 'em I've concluded not to make one of 'em. Ah, my dear fellow, you can't fool us that way. You can't fool us. It is the easiest thing in the world for a man to look as if he had had a great secret in him. Morning to ye, shipmates, morning. Morning it is, said I. Come along, Queequeg. Let's leave this crazy man. But stop. Tell me your name, will you? Elijah. Elijah, thought I, and we walked away, both commenting after each other's fashion upon this ragged old sailor, and agreed that he was nothing but a humbug, trying to be a bugbear. But we had not gone perhaps 100 yards, when chancing to turn a corner and looking back as I did so, who should be seen but Elijah following us, though at a distance. Somehow, the sight of him struck me so that I said nothing to Queequeg of his being behind, but passed on with my comrade, anxious to see whether the stranger would turn the same corner that we did. He did, and then it seemed to me that he was dogging us, but with the intent I could not for the life of me imagine. This circumstance, coupled with his ambiguous, half-hinting, half-revealing, shrouded sort of talk, now begat in me all kinds of vague wonderments and half-apprehensions, and all connected with the Pequod, and Captain Ahab, and the leg that he had lost, and the Cape Horn fit, and the silver calabash, and what Captain Peleg had said of him, when I left the ship the day previous, and the prediction of the Swatistic, and the voyage we had bound ourselves to sail, and 100 other shadowy things. I was resolved to satisfy myself whether this ragged Elijah was really dogging us or not, and with that intent crossed the way with Queequeg, and on that side of it retraced our steps. But Elijah passed on without seeming to notice us. This relieved me, and once more, and finally as it seemed to me, I pronounced him in my heart a humbug. 20, all astir. A day or two passed, and there was great activity aboard the Pequod. Not only were the old sails being mended, but new sails were coming on board, and bolts of canvas and coils of rigging, in short, everything betokened to that ship's preparation, were hurrying to a close. Captain Peleg seldom or never went ashore, but sat in his wigwam, keeping a sharp lookout upon the hands. Bildad did all the purchasing and providing at the stores, and the men employed in the hold and on the rigging were working till long after nightfall. On the day following Queequeg signing the articles, word was given at all the inns where the ship's company were stopping that their chests must be on board before night, for there was no telling how soon the vessel might be sailing. So Queequeg and I got down our traps, resolving, however, to sleep ashore till the last. But it seems they always give very long notice in these cases, and the ship did not sail for several days. But no wonder. There was a good deal to be done, and there is no telling how many things to be thought of before the Pequod was fully equipped. Everyone knows what a multitude of things, beds, saucepans, knives and forks, shovels and tongs, napkins, nutcrackers, and whatnot, are indispensable to the business of housekeeping. Just so with whaling, which necessitates a 3 years' housekeeping upon the wide ocean, far from all grocers, costermongers, doctors, bakers, and bankers. And though this also holds true of merchant vessels, yet not by any means to the same extent as with whalemen. For besides the great length of the whaling voyage, the numerous articles peculiar to the prosecution of the fishery, and the impossibility of replacing them at the remote harbors usually frequented, it must be remembered that of all ships, whaling vessels are the most exposed to accidents of all kinds, and especially to the destruction and loss of very things upon which the success of the voyage most depends. Hence, the spare boats, spare spars, spare lines and harpoons, and spare everythings, almost, but a spare captain and duplicate ship. At the period of our arrival at the island, the heaviest storage of the Pequod had been almost completed, comprising her beef, bread, water, fuel, and iron hoops and staves. But, as before hinted, for some time there was a continual fetching and carrying on board of divers odds and ends of things, both large and small. Chief among those who did this fetching and carrying was Captain Bildad's sister, a lean old lady of a most determined and indefatigable spirit, but withal very kind-hearted, who seemed resolved that if she could help it, nothing should be found wanting in the Pequod, after once fairly getting to sea. At one time she would come on board with a jar of pickles for the steward's pantry, another time with a bunch of quills for the chief mate's desk, where he kept his log, a third time with a roll of flannel for a small of someone's rheumatic back. Never did any woman better deserve her name, which was Charity, Aunt Charity, as everybody called her, and like a sister of Charity did this charitable Aunt Charity bustle about hither and thither, ready to turn her hand and heart to anything that promised to yield safety, comfort, and consolation to all on board a ship in which her beloved brother Bildad was concerned, and in which she herself owned a score or two of well-saved dollars.
But it was startling to see this excellent-hearted Quakeress coming on board, as she did the last day, with a long oil ladle in one hand and a still longer whaling lance in the other. Nor was Bildad himself nor Captain Peleg at all backward. As for Bildad, he carried about with him a long list of the articles needed, and at every fresh arrival, down went his mark opposite that article upon the paper. Every once in a while, Peleg came hobbling out of his whalebone den, roaring at the men down the hatchways, roaring up to the riggers at the masthead, and then concluded by roaring back into his wigwam. During these days of preparation, Queequeg and I often visited the craft, and as often I asked about Captain Ahab and how he was and when he was coming to come on board his ship. To these questions they would answer that he was getting better and better and was expected aboard every day. Meantime, the two captains, Peleg and Bildad, could attend to everything necessary to fit the vessel for the voyage. If I had been downright honest with myself, I would have seen very plainly in my heart that I did but half fancy being committed this way to so long a voyage, without once laying my eyes on the man who was to be the absolute dictator of it, so soon as the ship sailed out into the open sea. But when a man suspects any wrong, it sometimes happens that if he be already involved in the matter, he insensibly strives to cover up his suspicions even from himself. And much this way it was with me. I said nothing and tried to think nothing. At last it was given out that sometime next day the ship would certainly sail, so next morning Queequeg and I took a very early start. Chapter 21, Going Aboard. It was nearly 6 o'clock, but only gray and perfect misty dawn when we drew nigh the wharf. "There are some sailors running ahead there, if I see right," I said to Queequeg. "It can't be shadows. She's off by sunrise, I guess. Come on!" "Avast!" cried a voice, whose owner at the same time coming close behind us, laid a hand upon both our shoulders, and then insinuating himself between us, stood stooping forward a little in the uncertain twilight, strangely peering from Queequeg to me. It was Elijah. "Going aboard?" "Oh, hands off, will you?" said I. "Looky here," said Queequeg, shaking himself. "Go away." "Ain't going aboard, then?" "Yes, we are," said I, "but what business is that of yours? Do you know, Mr. Elijah, that I consider you a little impertinent?" No, I wasn't aware of that," said Elijah, slowly and wonderingly looking from me to Queequeg with the most unaccountable glances. "Elijah," said I, "you will oblige my friend and me by withdrawing. We are going to the Indian and Pacific Oceans and would prefer not to be detained." "Ye be ye? Coming back for breakfast?" "He's cracked, Queequeg," said I. "Come on." "Holloa!" cried stationary Elijah, hailing us when we had removed a few paces. "Never mind him," said I. "Queequeg, come on." But he stole up to us again, and suddenly, clapping his hand on my shoulder, said, Did you see anything looking like men going towards that ship a while ago? Struck by this plain, matter-of-fact question, I answered, saying, yes, I thought I did see 4 or 5 men, but it was too dim to be sure. Very dim, said Elijah. Morning to ye. Once more we quitted him, but once more he came softly after us, and touching my shoulder again, said, see if you can find him now, will ye? Find who? Morning to ye, he rejoined again, moving off. Oh, I was going to warn ye against, but never mind. It's all one, all in the family too. Sharp frost this morning, ain't it? Goodbye to you. Shan't see you again very soon, I guess, unless it's before the grand jury. And with these cracked words, he finally departed, leaving me for a moment in no small wonderment at his frantic impudence. At last, stepping on board the Pequod, we found everything in profound quiet, not a soul moving. The cabin entrance was locked within, the hatches were all on, and lumbered with coils of rigging. Going forward to the forecastle, we found the slide of the scuttle open. Seeing a light, we went down, and found only an old rigger there, wrapped in a tattered pea jacket. He was thrown at whole length upon 2 chests, his face downward and enclosed in his folded arms. The profoundest slumber slept upon him. Those sailors we saw, Queequeg, where can they have to? Said I, looking dubiously at the sleeper. But it seemed that, when on the wharf, Queequeg had not at all noticed what I now alluded to. Hence I would have thought myself to have been optically deceived in that matter, were it not for Elijah's otherwise inexplicable question. But I beat the thing down, and again, marking the sleeper, jocularly hinted to Queequeg that perhaps we had best sit upon with the body, telling him to establish himself accordingly. He put his hand upon the sleeper's rear, as though feeling if it was soft enough, and then, without more ado, sat quietly down there.
Gracious Queequeg, don't sit there, said I. Oh, poor Dodd's seat, said Queequeg, my country way, won't hurt him face. Face, said I, call that his face? Very benevolent countenance then, but how hard he breathes. He's heaving himself. Get off, Queequeg. You are heavy. It's grinding the face of the poor. Get off, Queequeg. Look, he'll twitch you off soon. I wonder he didn't wake. Queequeg removed himself to just beyond the head of the sleeper and lighted his tomahawk pipe. I sat at the feet. We kept the pipe passing over the sleeper from one to the other. Meanwhile, upon questioning him in his broken fashion, Queequeg gave me to understand that in his land, owing to the absence of settees and sofas of all sorts, the kings, chiefs, and the great people generally were in the custom of fattening some of the lower orders for ottomans and to furnish a house comfortably in that respect. You had only to buy up 8 or 10 lazy fellows and lay them around in piers and alcoves. Besides, it was very convenient on an excursion, much better than those garden chairs which are convertible into walking sticks. Upon occasion, a chief calling his attendant and desiring him to make a settee of himself under a spreading tree, perhaps in some damp, marshy place. While narrating these things, every time Queequeg received the tomahawk from me, he flourished the tomahawk side of it over the sleeper's head. What's that for, Queequeg? Pretty easy, killie. Oh, pretty easy. He was going on with some wild reminiscences about his tomahawk pipe, which it seemed had in its 2 uses both brained his foes and soothed his soul, when we were directly attracted to the sleeping rigger. The strong vapor now completely filled the contracted hole. It began to tell upon him. He breathed with a sort of muffledness that seemed troubled in the nose, then revolved over once or twice, then sat up and rubbed his eyes. Holy, he breathed at last. Who be ye smokers? Shipped men, answered I. When does she sail? Aye, ye are going to be in her. Be ye? She sails today. The captain came aboard last night. What captain? Ahab? But who him indeed? I was going to ask him some further questions concerning Ahab when we heard a noise on deck. Holy Starbuck astir, said the rigger. He's a lively chief mate, that good man, and a pious but all alive now, I must turn to. And so saying, he went on deck, and we followed. It was now clear sunrise. Soon the crew came on board in 2s and 3s. The riggers bestirred themselves, the mates were actively engaged, and several of the shore people were busy in bringing various things on board. Meanwhile, Captain Ahab remained invisibly enshrined within his cabin. At length towards noon, Chapter 22, Merry Christmas. At length towards noon, upon the final dismissal of the ship's riggers, and after the Pequod had been hauled out from the wharf, and after the ever-thoughtful Charity had come off in a whaleboat with her last gift, a nightcap for Stubb, the second mate, her brother-in-law, and a spare Bible for the steward. After all of this, the two captains, Peleg and Bildad, issued from the cabin, and turning to the chief mate, Peleg said, "Now, Mr. Starbuck, are you sure everything is right? Captain Ahab is all ready. Just spoke to him. Nothing more to be got from shore, Well, call all hands then. Muster 'em off. Here, blast 'em. No need of profound words. However great the hurry, Peleg, and said Peleg, but away with thee, friend Starbuck, and do our bidding. How now? Here upon the very point of the starting for the voyage, Captain Peleg and Captain Bildad were going in with a high hand on the quarter deck, just as if they were to be joint commanders at sea, as well as to all appearances in port. And as for Captain Ahab, no sign of him yet to be seen. Only they said that he was in the cabin. But then the idea was that his presence was by no means necessary in getting the ship underway and steering her well out to sea. Indeed, as that was not only his proper business, but the pilot's, and as yet he had not completely recovered, so they said. Therefore, Captain Ahab stayed below. And all this seemed natural enough, especially as in the merchant service many captains never show themselves on deck for a considerable period of time after heaving up the anchor, but remain over the captain table, having a farewell merrymaking with their shore friends before they quit the ship for good with the pilot. But there was not much chance to think over the matter, for Captain Peleg was now all alive. He seemed to do most of the talking and commanding, not Bildad. "Aft here, ye sons of bachelors," he cried as the sailors lingered at the mainmast. "Mr. Starbuck, drive 'em aft."
"Strike the tent there," was the next order. As I hinted before, this whalebone marquee was never pitched except in port, and on board the Pequod for 30 years, the order to strike the tent was well known to be the next thing to heaving up the anchor. "Man the capstan! Blood and thunder, jump!" was the next command, and the crew sprang for the handspikes. Now, in getting underway, the station generally occupied by the pilot is the forward part of the ship, and here Bildad, who with Peleg, be it known, in addition to his other officers, was one of the licensed pilots of the port. He being suspected to have got himself made a pilot in order to save the Nantucket pilot fee to all the ships he was concerned in, for he never piloted any other craft. Bildad, I say, might now be seen actively engaged in looking over the bows for the approaching anchor, and at intervals singing what seemed a dismal stave of psalmody to cheer the hands at the windlass, who roared forth some sort of chorus about the girls in Booble Alley with hearty goodwill. Nevertheless, not 3 days previous, Bildad had told them that no profane songs would be allowed on board the Pequod, particularly in getting underway. And Charity, his sister, had placed a small choice copy of Watts in each seaman's berth. Meantime, overseeing the other part of the ship, Captain Peleg ripped and swore astern in the most frightful manner. I almost thought he would sink the ship before the anchor could be got up. Involuntarily, I paused on my handspike and told Queequeg to do the same, thinking of the perils we both ran in starting on the voyage with such a devil for a pilot. I was comforting myself, however, with the thought that in pious Bildad might be found some salvation, spite of his 777th lay, when I felt a sudden sharp poke in my rear, and turning around was horrified at the apparition of Captain Peleg and the art of withdrawing his leg from my immediate vicinity. That was my first kick. "Is that the way they heave in the merchant service?" he roared. "Spring, thou sheephead, spring and break thy backbone. Why don't you spring, I say, all of ya, spring! Quahog, spring, thou chap with the red whiskers." At last the anchor was up, the sails were set, and off we glided. It was a short, cold Christmas, and as the short northern day merged into night, we found ourselves almost broad upon the wintry ocean, whose freezing spray cased us in ice as in polished armor. The long rows of teeth on the bulwarks glistened in the moonlight, and like the white ivory tusks of some huge elephant, vast curving icicles depended from the bows. Lank Bildad, as pilot, headed the first watch, and ever and anon, as the old craft deep dived into the green seas and sent the shivering frost all over her, and the winds howled, and the cordage rang, his steady notes were heard. Sweet fields beyond the swelling flood stand dressed in living green. So to the Jews old Canaan stood, while Jordan rolled between.
Never did those sweet words sound more sweetly to me than then. They were full of hope and fruition. Spite of this frigid weather night in the boisterous Atlantic, spite of my wet feet and wetter jacket, there was yet, it even then seemed to me, many a pleasant haven in store, and meads and glades so eternally vernal that the grass shot up by the spring, untrodden, unwilted, remains at midsummer. At last we gained such an offing that the two pilots were needed no longer. The stout sailboat that had accompanied us began ringing alongside. It was curious and not unpleasing how Peleg and Bildad were affected at this juncture, especially Captain Bildad. For loath to depart yet, very loath to leave for good, a ship bound on so long and perilous a voyage, beyond both stormy capes, a ship in which some thousands of his hard-earned dollars were invested, a ship in which an old shipmate sailed as captain, a man almost as old as he, once more starting to encounter all the terrors of the pitiless jaw, loath to say goodbye to a thing so every way brimful of every interest to him. Poor old Bildad lingered long, pacing the deck with anxious strides, ran down into the cabin to speak another farewell word there, again came on deck, and looked to windward, looked toward the wide and endless waters, only bounded by the far-off, unseen eastern continents. Looked toward the land, looked aloft, looked right and left, looked everywhere and nowhere, and at last, mechanically coiling a rope upon its pin, convulsively grasped stout Peleg by the hand, and holding up a lantern, for a moment stood gazing heroically in his face, as much to say, "Nevertheless, friend Peleg, I can stand it. Yes, I can." As for Peleg, he himself took it more like a philosopher, but for all his philosophy, there was a tear twinkling in his eye when the lantern came too near, and he too did not a little run from cabin to deck, now a word below, and now a word with Starbuck, the chief mate. But at last he turned to his comrade with a final sort of look about him. "Captain Bildad, come, old shipmate, we must go. Back the main yard there, boat ahoy. Stand by to come close alongside now. Careful, careful, come, Bildad, boy, say your last. Luck to ye, Starbuck, luck to ye, Mr. Stubb, luck to ye, Mr. Flask, goodbye and good luck to ye all. And this day, 3 years, I'll have a hot supper smoking for ye in old Nantucket. Hurrah and away." "God bless ye, and have ye in his holy keeping, men," murmured old Bildad almost incoherently. "I hope you'll have fine weather now, so that Captain Ahab may soon be moving among ye. A pleasant sun is all he needs, and you'll have plenty of them in the tropic voyage ye go. Be careful in the hunt, ye mates. Don't stake the boats needlessly, ye harpooners. Good white cedar plank is raised full 3% within the year. Don't forget your prayers either, Mr. Starbuck. Mind that Cooper don't waste the spare staves. Oh, the sail needles are in the green locker. Don't wheel it too much, a Lord's Day, men. But don't miss a fair chance either. That's rejecting heaven's good gifts. Have an eye to the molasses tears, Mr. Stubb. It was a little leaky, I thought. If ye touch at the islands, Mr. Flask, beware of fornication. Goodbye, goodbye. Don't keep that cheese too long down in the hold, Mr. Starbuck. It'll spoil. Be careful with the butter. 20 cents the pound it was. And mind ye if... Come, come, Bildad, stop palavering. Away. And with that, Peleg hurried him over the side, and both dropped into the boat. Ship and boat diverged. The cold, damp night breeze blew between. A screaming gull flew overhead. The two hulls wildly rolled. We gave 3 heavy-hearted cheers and blindly plunged like fate into the lone Atlantic.
23, the lee shore. Some chapters back, when Bulkington was spoken of, a tall, new-landed mariner, encountered in New Bedford at the inn. When on that shivering winter's night, the Pequod thrust her vindictive bows into the cold, malicious waves, who should I see standing at her helm but Bulkington? I looked with sympathetic awe and fearfulness upon the man who in midwinter, just lauded from a 4 years' dangerous voyage, could so unrestingly push off again for still another tempestuous term. The land seemed scorching to his feet. Wonderfulest things are ever the unmentionable. Deep memories yield no epitaphs. This 6-inch chapter is the stoneless grave of Bulkington. Let me only say that it fared with him as with the storm-tossed ship that miserably drives along the leeward land. The port would fain give succor, that the port is pitiful, in the port is safety, comfort, hearthstone, supper, warm blankets, friends, all that's kind to our mortalities. But in that gale, the port, the land is that ship's direst jeopardy. She must fly all hospitality. One touch of land, though, it but graze the keel, would make her shudder through and through. With all her might, she crowds all sail offshore. In so doing, fights against the very winds that fain would blow her homeward. Seeks all the lashed seas landlessness again, for refuge's sake, for lonely rushing into peril, her only friend, her bitterest foe. Know you now, Bulkington, glimpses do you seem to see of that mortally intolerable truth, that all deep, earnest thinking is but the intrepid effort of the soul to keep the open independence of her sea, while the wildest winds of heaven and earth conspire to cast her on the treacherous Slavish shore? But as in the landlessness alone resides highest truth, shoreless, indefinite as God, so better is it to perish in that howling infinite than be ingloriously dashed upon the lee, even if that were safety. For worm-like then, oh, who would crave and crawl to land? Terrors of the terrible. Is all this agony so vain? Take heart, O Bulkington. Bear thee grimly, demigod. Up from the spray of thy ocean perishing, straight up leaps thy hypothesis. 24, the advocate. As Queequeg and I are now fairly embarked in this business of whaling, and as this business of whaling is somehow come to be regarded among landsmen as a rather unpoetical and disreputable pursuit, therefore I am all anxiety to convince ye landsmen, of the injustice hereby done to us hunters of whales. In the first place, it may be deemed almost superfluous to establish the fact that among people at large, the business of whaling is not accounted on a level with that which are called the liberal professions. If a stranger were introduced into any miscellaneous metropolitan society, it would but slightly advance the general opinion of his merits. Were he presented to the company as a harpooneer, say, and if in emulation of the naval officers he should append the initials SWF, sperm whale fishery, to his visiting card, such a procedure would be deemed preeminently presuming and ridiculous. Doubtless one leading reason why the world declines honoring us whalemen is this. They think that at best our vocation amounts to a butchering sort of business, and that when actively engaged therein, we are surrounded by all manner of defilements. Butchers we are, that is true, but butchers also, and butchers of the bloodiest badge, have been all martial commanders whom the world invariably delights to honor. And as for the matter of the alleged uncleanliness of our business, you shall soon be initialed into the certain facts hereto pretty generally unknown, and which upon the whole will triumphantly plant the sperm whale ship at least among the cleanest things of this tidy earth. But even granting the charge in question to be true, what disordered, slippery decks of a whale ship are comparable to the unspeakable carrion of those battlefields from which so many soldiers return to drink in all ladies' plaudits? And if the ideal of peril so much enhances the popular conceit of the soldier's profession, let me assure ye that many a veteran who has freely marched up to a battery would quickly recoil at the apparition of the sperm whale's vast tail, fanning its eddies, the air over his head. For what are the comprehensible terms of man, terrors of man, compared with the interlinked terrors and wonders of God?
But though the world scouts at us, whale hunters, yet does it unwittingly pay us the profoundest homage, yea, and all abounding adoration. For almost all the tapers, lamps, and candles that burn around the globe burn as before so many shrines to our glory. But look at this matter in other lights. Weigh it in all sorts of scales. See what we whalemen are and have been. Why did the Dutch in De Witt's time have admirals of their whaling fleets? What did Louis XVI of France, at his own personal expense, fit out whaling ships from Dunkirk and politely invite to that town some score or two of families from our own Isle of Nantucket? Why did Britain, between the years 1750 and 1788, pay to her whalemen in bounties upwards of £1 million? And lastly, how comes it that we whalemen of America now outnumber all the rest of the banded whalemen in the world? Sail a navy of upwards of 700 vessels manned by 18,000 men, nearly consuming $4 million, the ship's worth at the time of sailing, $20 million, and every year importing into our harbors a well-reaped harvest of $7 million. How comes all of this if there be not something pursuant in whaling? But this is not the half. Look again. I freely assert that the cosmopolitan philosopher cannot, for his life, point out the one single peaceful influence which within the last 60 years has operated more potentially upon the whole broad world, taking in one aggregate that the high and the mighty business of whaling. One way and another, it has begotten events so remarkable in themselves, and that so consistently momentous in their sequential issues, that whaling may well be regarded as that Egyptian mother who bore offspring themselves pregnant from her womb. It would be hopeless, endless task to categorize all these things. Let a handful suffice. For many years past, the whale ship has been the pioneer in ferreting out the remotest and least known parts of the earth. She has explored seas and archipelagos which had no chart, where no Cook or Vancouver had ever sailed. If American and European men of war now peacefully ride in once savage harbors, let them fire salutes to the honor and the glory of the whale ship which originally showed them the way, and first interpreted between them and the savages. They may celebrate as they will the heroes of exploring expeditions, your Cooks, your Crusensterns, but I say that scores of anonymous captains have sailed out of Nantucket that were as grand and greater than your Cook and your Crusenster. For it is that succorless empty-handedness they, in that heathenish shark waters, and by beaches of unrecorded javelin islands, battled with the virgin wonders and terrors that Cook, with all of his marines and muskets, would not willingly have dared. All that is made such a flourish of in the old South Sea voyages, those things that were the lifetime commonplaces of our heroic Nantucketers. Often adventures which Vancouver dedicates these 3 chapters to, these men accountingly unworthy being set down in the ship's common log. Ah, the world, oh, the world. Until the whale fishery rounded Cape Horn, no commerce but colonial, scarcely any intercourse but colonial, was carried on between Europe and the long line of opulent Spanish provinces on the Pacific coast. It was the whalemen who first broke through the jealous policy of the Spanish crown touching those colonies, and if space permitted, it might be distinctly shown how from these whalemen at last eventuated the liberation of Peru, Chile, and Bolivia from the yoke of old Spain, and the establishment of the eternal democracy in those parts. That great America
on the other side of the sphere, Australia, was given to the enlightened world by the whalemen. After its first blunder-born discovery by a Dutchman, all other ships long shunned those shores as pestiferously barbarous, but the whale ship touched there. The whale ship is the true mother of that now mighty colony. Moreover, in the infancy of the first Australian settlement, the emigrants were several times saved from starvation by the benevolent biscuit of the whale ship, luckily dropping an anchor in their waters. The uncounted isle of all Polynesia confess the same truth and do commercial homage to the whale ship that cleared the way for the missionary and the merchant, and in many cases carried the primitive missionaries to their first destinations. If that double-bolted land, Japan, is ever to become hospitable, it is the whale ship alone to whom the credit will be due, for already she is on the threshold. But if, in the face of all this, you still declare that whaling has no aesthetically noble associations connected with it, then am I ready to shiver 50 lances with you there, and unhorse you with a split helmet every time. The whale has no famous author, and whaling no famous chronicler, you will say. The whale no famous author, and whaling no famous chronicler? Who wrote the first account of our Leviathan? Who but mighty Job? And who composed the first narrative of a whaling voyage? Who but no less a prince than Alfred the Great, who, with his own royal pen, took down the words from the Norwegian whale hunters of those times, and who pronounced our glowing eulogy in Parliament? Who but Edmund Burke? True enough, but when whalemen themselves are poor devils, they have no good blood in their veins. No good blood in their veins? They have something better than royal blood there. The grandmother of Benjamin Franklin was Mary Morrill, afterwards, by marriage, Mary Folger, one of the old settlers of Nantucket, and the ancestress to a long line of Folgers and harpooneers, all kith and kin to noble Benjamin, this day darting the barbed iron from one side of the world to the other. Good again, but then all confess that somehow whaling is not respectable. Whaling not respectable? Whaling is imperial. By Old English statuary law, the whale is declared a royal fish. Oh, that's only nominal. The whale himself has never figured in any grand, imposing way. The whale never figured in any grand, imposing way? In one of the mighty triumphs given to a Roman general upon his entering the world's capital, the bones of a whale, brought all the way from the Syrian coast, were the most conspicuous object in the cymballed procession. Grant it, since you cite it, but say what you will, there is no real dignity in whaling. No dignity in whaling? The dignity of our calling, the very heavens attest. Cetus is a constellation in the south, no more. Drive down your hat in presence of the Tsar and take it off to Queequeg, no more. I know a man that in his lifetime has taken 350 whales. I account that man more honorable than that great captain of antiquity who boasted of taking as many walled towns. And as for me, if by any possibility there may be any as yet undiscovered prime thing in me, if I shall ever deserve any real repute in that small, high-hushed world which I might not be unreasonably ambitious of, if hereafter I shall do anything that upon the whole a man might rather have done than to have left undone, if at my death my executors, or more properly my creditors, find any precious MSS in my desk, and here I prospectively ascribe all the honor and the glory to whaling, for a whale ship was my Yale College and my Harvard.